The first time anyone on Tangier Creek noticed Micah Talbot loading a collapsed oyster cage under the back of his uncle's skiff, they figured he was hauling it to the dump. Nobody thought twice about it. Rusted-out gear like that sat behind half the docks on the eastern shore, stacked in the marsh grass and slowly sinking into the mud, forgotten by watermen who'd given up oystering when the leases stopped paying. Micah had asked 3 different families if he could take their old gear off their hands, and every one of them said yes without hesitation, because who in their right mind wanted a pile of rusted wire cages that hadn't held a living oyster in years? Then he asked a 4th waterman, and a 5th. By the time the marsh grass came back green that April, 17-year-old Micah had collected more than 60 abandoned oyster cages, stacking them in neat rows along the shoreline behind his family's crab-shedding shed, like he was building towards something the whole village could see, but nobody could quite explain. His mother asked him once over supper what exactly he thought he was doing with a yard full of dead gear. He just said, "Still working it out," and went back to his plate. That wasn't an answer, but it was the only one he gave anyone for a long time. If you enjoy stories about patience, coastal life, and ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else threw away, subscribe and join us for more every week. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Tangier Creek sat on Virginia's eastern shore, a spit of marsh and tidal creek 2 hours south of the Maryland line, the kind of place where the Chesapeake Bay had shaped every family's living for 200 years and was, in the last few decades, shaping fewer of them every season. The Talbots had crabbed and oystered that water for 4 generations, though by the time Micah was born, most of the oyster grounds his great-grandfather worked had gone quiet, wiped down hard by disease and overharvest back in the 80s and 90s, and never fully recovered. Micah had grown up on the water the way most kids on the shore did, running trot lines before school, culling crabs after. He wasn't the kind of kid teachers singled out for anything in particular, quiet, watchful, more likely to study how something worked than to talk about it. Fine grades, fine attendance, nothing that told the adults around him he was chasing anything, which made it strange when he started asking around about oysters. It started small, the way these things do, a conversation at the bait shop with an old waterman named Purnell Ayers, 79 years old, who'd oystered that creek for 50-some years before his knees gave out and the leases dried up along with the beds. Micah asked him questions that didn't sound like idle curiosity. Questions about salinity, about why an oyster bed could die off in a single bad summer, about the difference between wild spat and hatchery-raised seed. Purnell, flattered that anyone under 60 cared, talked for the better part of 2 hours standing in the shade of the shop's tin awning. Then Micah started collecting gear. Every dock had its own story about why the cages sat rusting. The Bellamy family's beds had gone under during a bad dermo outbreak a decade back, and nobody'd had the heart to restock. The Custis brothers had switched over to crabbing full-time after 2 straight seasons of losing half their spat to sediment smothering the cages before the oysters could ever grow big enough to sell. Some gear had simply been abandoned when the old leases lapsed and nobody renewed the paperwork with the Marine Resources Commission. All of it was considered dead weight, taking up yard space better used for something else. One of the Custis cages, when Micah finally got it home and hosed the mud off, turned out to still be sound underneath the rust, the vinyl coating on the wire mostly intact. It became one of the first cages he ever put back into the water. Proof, before he'd fully believed it himself, that gear written off as junk could still have a working life left in it. Micah didn't think the gear was worthless. He just wasn't ready to say why yet. The village noticed the shed filling up with rusted cages before anyone else noticed much else. His best friend Wes cornered him one afternoon while they were rebaiting crab pots down at the dock. "You're not seriously trying to start an oyster farm with garbage cages, are you?" "Working on it," Micah said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." Wes let it drop, mostly because Micah had that particular look on his face he got whenever his mind was already made up and talking wasn't going to move it an inch. What nobody knew yet was that Micah was chasing an idea he couldn't fully explain, one taking shape a little at a time in a water-stained composition notebook he kept in the dry bag on his skiff. Pages of sketches, tide charts, notes copied out of a library book on aquaculture, printouts from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science Extension Office, and a running list of questions he intended to ask the one man on the creek who might actually have real answers. That man was Delbert Costin, 76 years old, a retired commercial oysterman who ran close to 40 acres of leased bottom before his back gave out and his wife made him promise to slow down. Delbert lived alone in a low clapboard house at the end of the point, surrounded by crab pots stacked 12 high and a yard of boat parts nobody else could identify. And most kids in the village were a little wary of him, since he didn't have much patience for foolishness. Micah showed up at his door on a Saturday morning with his notebook and a question that had been sitting in him for weeks. Was it possible to grow healthy oysters with cages that had already failed once, on ground that had already lost a crop? Delbert looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Depends what killed the ground," he said. "Sit down." That was the start of something neither one of them expected. Over the following weeks, Delbert became something between a teacher and a professional skeptic, testing Micah constantly and refusing to hand him easy answers. He explained that a bed's health could usually be read the same way a waterman read the sky before a squall, if a person knew what to look for. Salinity mattered more than most people realized, he said. Oysters needed water somewhere between 14 and 28 parts per thousand salt to thrive. Too fresh, after a heavy spring runoff, and disease pressure dropped to nothing. Too salty, and predators like oyster drills and certain diseases got the upper hand fast. Most of what killed these grounds wasn't some big mystery, Delbert told him one afternoon, holding up a length of vinyl-coated wire from one of Micah's salvaged cages. It was neglect and bad timing, same as anything else on this water. Sediment settles on a cage sitting too close to the mud, chokes the spat before it ever gets big enough to matter. Folks stack too many oysters in one cage, don't turn it enough, and wonder why half of them starve out on account of crowding. Oysters don't fail on their own. People fail the oysters. That line stuck with Micah harder than anything else Delbert told him that spring. Not every lesson came easy. Micah's first attempt at seeding one of the salvaged cages went badly. He'd bought a bag of hatchery spat on shell from a supplier up near the Rappahannock, dumped the whole bag into a cage set too low in the water column near a muddy bottom, and within 3 weeks pulled the cage to find most of the young oysters smothered under a half-inch of settled silt. Delbert didn't sugarcoat it. "You set it too deep and too close to that mud bank," he said. "Water moves through a cage, it's got to be able to flush the silt out, or you're just building a trap. You want it up in the column, off the bottom, where the current can work through the mesh." Micah rebuilt his approach around that lesson, rigging his cages to floating lines instead of bottom-set racks, letting them ride higher in the water column where tidal current could flush sediment through the mesh instead of letting it settle. It was slow, unglamorous work, patching torn vinyl coating with a heat gun, replacing corroded clips, pressure washing 40 years of marsh muck off wire that had sat forgotten since before Micah was born. By early summer, the first dozen reworked cages were in the water and holding steady. Micah learned to read a healthy cage the way Delbert read the tide, checking the oyster's shell growth rings every couple weeks, watching for the telltale cupped shape of a well-fed animal versus the thin flat shell of one struggling in poor water. He learned about biofouling too, how barnacles, mussels, and mudworms would colonize a cage within weeks if he didn't flip and dry it on schedule, out of the water long enough in the sun to kill off the hitchhikers without stressing the oysters themselves. He also started paying attention to the creek's whole tidal rhythm in a way he never had before, mapping where the strongest flush ran on an outgoing tide, where the water sat still and warm on the flats and grew algae fast enough to feed a cage without extra work, where an afternoon thunderstorm dumped enough freshwater runoff to knock down salinity for 2 full days afterward. Slowly, without quite meaning to, Micah was learning the whole ecology of Tangier Creek from the perspective of a creature most people on it had simply stopped thinking about. Word got around the way it always did on a creek that size. Not all of it was kind. A couple of the older watermen joked at the bait shop that the Talbot boy had lost his mind messing with dead gear when there was real money to be made running crab pots. His uncle asked his father, half serious, whether Micah needed to see somebody about it. His father, to his credit, mostly stayed quiet and let the boy work. Not everyone was dismissive, though. Pernell Ayers started stopping by most weeks just to look at the cages, standing at a respectful distance on the dock, nodding like he approved of something he couldn't quite put a name to yet. Wes started helping on weekends too, hauling cages and getting his hands sliced up on rusty wire edges often enough that he stopped complaining about the smell of drying algae. The real turning point came in late July, during the worst heat spell the shore had seen in nearly a decade. Water temperatures pushing into the mid-80s for 2 straight weeks. 2 of the established leaseholders further up the creek lost a significant share of their crop that month to a sudden spike in dermo disease pressure, the parasite that thrives in warm, high salinity water and had wiped out entire beds on the bay before. Micah's cages, riding high in the water column where he could pull and inspect them easily, came through largely untouched. He'd been checking salinity with a cheap refractometer every few days that summer, moving his floating line slightly when a freshwater plume from an upstream creek pushed the numbers down, keeping his animals in a steadier range than the fixed bottom leases further up could manage. That got people's attention in a way explanations never could have. By late July, Micah had split his best-performing cages and folded in another dozen rebuilds from his salvage stock, pushing his total past 30 working cages. Growth like that came from careful management as much as luck. Delbert had taught him to recognize when a cage was overcrowded, oysters growing slower and thinner-shelled from competition for the same water, and how to thin a cage and start a second one rather than lose growth across the whole batch. But summer wasn't finished testing him yet. In early August, Micah noticed something wrong in one of his proudest cages, one of the very first he'd brought back from a pile of rusted junk behind the Bellamy dock. The oysters seemed sluggish, gaping slightly even when he pulled the cage from the water, which normally triggered them to clamp shut fast. When he cracked one open to check, his stomach dropped. The meat inside looked thin and watery instead of plump, and several animals in the cage had died outright, their shells gaping and empty. He motored straight over to Delbert's dock with 3 of the worst oysters wrapped in a wet towel. Delbert turned them over under the bright shop light for a long time before he spoke. "Could be a couple things," he said finally. "Could be MSX got into that cage if the salinity's crept up enough this summer. If that's what it is, there's not much saving that batch, and you'd want to move the rest of your gear off that stretch before it spreads." Micah's throat felt tight. Weeks of careful work, maybe undone by something he hadn't even seen coming. They ran a simple field assay Delbert kept in an old tackle box, testing tissue from the dead oysters. It came back negative for MSX. The real culprit, they worked out over the next few days of watching the cage closely, was a sudden localized salinity spike after 2 weeks with almost no rain, water in that particular stretch of creek climbing higher in salt content than the rest of Micah's cages, stressing the animals past what they could handle even without an active disease driving it. "This is the part nobody tells you when they picture this work," Delbert said, snapping the lid back onto his test kit. "Most days it's not really about the oysters at all. It's about noticing something's gone wrong early enough that you can still do something about it." Micah moved that cage the following week to a stretch of creek with steadier flow and lower average salinity, a spot he'd marked in his notebook back in June for a possible backup site. Within 12 days, the surviving oysters had stopped gaping and started feeding normally again. It was a small crisis in the scope of everything he was building, but it taught him something that stuck harder than any success that summer had taught him. A thriving cage wasn't a finished project. It was something you kept watching, season after season, the same way you'd watch over anything alive and worth keeping. By September, Micah was running better than 40 working cages, every single one rebuilt from gear the creek had already written off. He harvested his first real crop that month, hand-culling market-size oysters into mesh bags at Delbert's dock, the 2 of them working late into the evening while gulls circled overhead and the tide dropped out around the pilings. It wasn't a fortune, a few thousand oysters sold to a seafood buyer in Ononcock and to a small raw bar 2 towns over, plus what he sold straight off the dock in burlap sacks with a hand-lettered sign. But it was never really about the money, and most people who talked to Micah that fall understood that pretty quickly. What he'd actually built became clear only when a local restaurant owner started asking him a question nobody expected. Could he guarantee steady supply through the following season, and would he be willing to talk to two other young guys on the creek who wanted to learn the same salvage and float method he'd been quietly working out all summer? Winter brought its own quiet test, one that came without any real drama at all, just cold, patient waiting. Delbert had warned him that more cages failed over winter than any other season, not from the cold itself, since oysters handled Chesapeake winters just fine, but from ice damage to poorly maintained floats and from cages left too shallow where surface ice could crush the mesh flat. So through November, Micah went over every cage one more time, checking float lines, adding extra flotation where needed, and moving his shallowest cages to slightly deeper water where the ice couldn't reach the mesh even in a hard freeze. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. He checked the lines every couple weeks through the cold months anyway, breaking thin skims of ice off the float markers, watching for any sign of a cage that had shifted or gone under. Some weeks the quiet unsettled him more than any disease scare had. When the first warm days of March finally came and he pulled the first cages of the new year, he found the oysters exactly where he'd left them, quiet through the cold months, but alive, shells tightly closed and healthy, ready to start feeding again as the water warmed. That same spring, once water temperatures climbed back into the growing range, Micah moved 8 of his strongest cages onto a stretch of the old Bellamy lease, the same water that had gone under to disease a decade earlier and never been restocked. Ernest Bellamy himself, 71 years old and long since retired from oystering, watched the delivery from his dock with his arms crossed, saying nothing at first. He'd started stopping by the Talbot shed a few times that winter, never staying long, just asking a question or two about how the cages were holding up before heading home. 8 weeks later, Ernest stood at the edge of his old lease looking at water that, for the first time in 10 years, had working oyster gear sitting in it again. He drove over to the Talbot place that same afternoon, found Micah repairing a float line, and stood there a long moment before he spoke. "Didn't think much of what you were doing with all that rusted gear," he said. "I know, wasn't sure you did either, honestly." Micah almost laughed. Ernest nodded slowly, looked out over the shed still holding a dozen more cages waiting for repair, and said the closest thing to an apology the man was ever likely to give. "Well, glad somebody on this creek was still paying attention to it." By the following year, Micah was running close to 70 cages and had a standing arrangement to supply oysters to 3 restaurants across 2 counties. Purnell Ayres came by most weekends just to sit on the dock and talk oysters, something he later admitted gave him more purpose than he'd felt in years since his knees stopped letting him work the water himself. Delbert Costin, for his part, never quite stopped correcting Micah's technique, though the corrections got smaller and less frequent as the seasons went by. The creek didn't change overnight, but something in the way people looked at a pile of rusted gear sitting behind a dock did change. A dead cage stopped being trash and started being potential. A quiet, unremarkable kid stopped being someone the older watermen worried about and became someone a few of them quietly started to respect. What Micah had built wasn't flashy, it wasn't an empire, and it hadn't come from any one lucky break. It was a slow, patient system of rebuilt gear, healthy cages, and restored bottom that the creek had written off as finished. Proof that most of what a place like Tangier Creek considers worthless just needs somebody willing to look closer and ask why, instead of assuming they already know the answer. He still keeps that water-stained notebook, filled now with 3 years of tide charts and salinity readings instead of a handful of sketches. And every spring, when the first cages go back in the water and the creek starts working again the way it used to, a few more people remember exactly why they doubted him and exactly why they don't anymore. If you've ever worked a piece of water or land or anything else nobody else believed in, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else already gave up on.